Welcome to the Aboriginal channel. On this episode, we're going to be learning about the many different railroad stations and railroads that the Aboriginal Americans had here in the Western Hemisphere before the Europeans took them over. And in order to do that, we have to look right here at the battles of the American Civil War, because that is when the Europeans took over the railroads from the American Indians. That point can be proven in such a simple way as in the wordage used by the current president in many of his speeches when he declares that he's the most presidential president in the history of America except for Abraham Lincoln. And at other times he has stated how he has worked as hard as Abraham Lincoln, though Abraham Lincoln was a hard worker. And that's simply him metaphorically speaking of how Abraham Lincoln put together the plan to take the South from the American Indian. As you can look right here on this map, you see all the way up here in New England and the northern states where there ain't many battles. And that's because Indians from those areas were fighting from the mid 1700s, or we can even say from the 1600s all the way up until the end of the War of 1812, basically. After that war, they turned their attention to the southern part of the United States, where you had the Creek War, the first Seminole Wars in like that 1820. Then you had them posting up the Choctaw Agency in 1825, and then they were getting counties and stuff in the 1820s, 30s, 40s, and 50s from different Cherokees, Creeks, Choctaws, Chickasaw Indians. And then finally you have this wars in the 1860s. And some of these, like right here in the handle of Texas, New Mexico, and Oklahoma, you can go and look, and all those will show you that those were actual Indians fighting. So over here, they're telling you that this was white on white, but too much other evidence speaks to the contrary. One of those is the railroad system, which we're going to take a look at right now. Right here, we're looking at an image of railroads in the South before 1860. Now, this image is from a book called Old South, New South by Gavin Wright, Revolutions in the Southern Economy Since the Civil War. And my presumption is that most of these railroads belong to and were created by American Indians. If you look at the details of how these tracks are laid, they kind of tell the truth in and of themselves. As you look right down here in Louisiana, you see a little track right here going from the river to over this way, which tells me that what railroad track was a means of transporting certain things from one village to another. And same goes for these other ones right here, these standalone tracks. Europeans didn't make tracks like that, in my mind. So down here in Florida, you have this same little track off the line right here. It seemed like they would have made it connect all the way through. However, when you have different tribes, that could have been a ending point of one tribe's territory and the beginning of another one's type of deal. But as you look back over here at Louisiana, you see that it had minimal railroad tracks in 1860 or before that. It had the little small ones down here, one going from Monroe to Vicksburg, and then that's about it. Then you look over here in Texas, you see that before the Civil War, basically, there was one going down this way and some going up this way from Galveston. Now, we look back at this Civil War's battle map, and you see there was a couple of battles right here in that part of Texas where there was railroads going this way. Then another image from that book shows the railroad tracks from 1860 to 1890. And so if you look down here, Louisiana has basically railroad tracks going through where those battles were. But if you look down here, right here at Texas, you already had this one going from left to right. But after the battles, you had this one going from south to north right here, which happened to be right here through this big battle site during the Civil War. And when it's dark like that, it means during the course of the whole war from 1861 to 1865, there were numerous different battles there throughout those years. And that basically means that the Indians there was holding it down for a long time until eventually the Europeans were able to penetrate the walls that they had. Now, at this point, it really would be wise to screenshot this so you can compare it to these railroad tracks that were there in 1860 and then those who were put in place from 1860 to 1890. And if you look at Louisiana right here, you'll see that these battle sites didn't have railroad tracks in them before the war, but did afterwards, indicating that Europeans before the war weren't able to come in and do what they wanted to do with the place. But then after that, they were, which can only mean one thing. But we dealing with the fact that did Indians really have trains or railroad tracks? So right here on online, it says Railroads of the Confederacy at battlefields.org. It says the Union Army also burned bridges and destroyed tunnels and captured as much railroad equipment as they could. Their greatest catch was in 1863 when General Joseph E. Johnston abandoned Jackson, Mississippi, leaving 90 locomotives and hundreds of railroad cars behind. Now, because that was in 1863 and they had just started the railroads in the 1830s, there's no way that they could have had 90 locomotives and hundreds of railroad cars in Jackson, Mississippi, unless railroads, locomotives, and railroad cars were built way before that time. But we'll go back over and look at those images of railroad tracks and look at the tracks in Jackson, Mississippi before 1860 and after. Now, it says that Jackson that was a major crossing point right there before the Civil War. But if you remember looking at the battles map, you remember there was major battles right here, over here in Alabama, up here, definitely right through here in Georgia. And then see these spots right here hitting the coast. Charleston, I think that's Savannah, Charleston, Wilmington, North Carolina. All these little spots had battles in them during the Civil War. Now you see right here where we started, this cluster right here in Mississippi. Jackson is right there. And then over here, you see there was battles. And then you go over into Alabama, there was battles. Then, like I said before, showed you right here in Georgia, all those battles, and then major battles over here as well. And then starting down here in Florida, in Jacksonville, you see battles, and then over here in Wilmington, North Carolina, battles, and then all these major battles right here in Virginia. In order to get a better idea to know whether or not Indians had railroads, we have to look at Virginia a little bit. Right here it says the Falling Creek Iron Works was the first iron production facility in North America. It was established by the Virginia Company of London in Henrico City on Falling Creek, near its confluence of the James River. It was short-lived due to an attack by the Native Americans in 1622. Now, in previous videos, I've put emphasis on that Indian massacre right there in 1622 in Jamestown, when the settler population or the European population was brought down to 180 people. And that's the same attack by Native Americans in 1622 that it's talking about right here. It goes on to say that records which have survived indicate that ironworks was able to produce some quantity of iron. However, from the extant records, it cannot be determined whether the ironworks had begun full production before operations were interrupted by the Indian massacre of 1622. So Indians had iron way back in the 1600s. But let's go back over here to Jackson, Mississippi. It says the region that is now the city of Jackson was historically part of the large territory occupied by the Choctaw Nation. The historic culture of the Muskogee-speaking indigenous peoples who had inhabited the area for thousands of years before European colonization. The Choctaw name for the local was Shishafoka. The area now called Jackson was obtained by the United States under the terms of the Treaty of Dokestan in 1820. And it goes on to say that Jackson was connected by public road to Vicksburg and Clinton in 1826. And Jackson was first connected by railroad to other cities in 1840. It says in 1844, a map shows Jackson linked by an east-west rail line running between Vicksburg, Raymond, and Brandon. Unlike Vicksburg, Greenville, and Natchez, Jackson is not located on the Mississippi River, and it did not develop during the antebellum era, as those cities did from major river commerce. Construction of railroad lines to the city sparked its growth in the decades following the American Civil War. Now we're seeing where it's saying that construction of railroad lines to the city sparked its growth in the decades following the Civil War. Yet right here it says the Union Army burned bridges and destroyed tunnels and captured as much railroad equipment as they could. Their greatest catch was in 1863 when General Joseph E. Johnston abandoned Jackson, Mississippi, leaving 90 locomotives and hundreds of railroad cars behind. Now, if you narrowed in on the timelines, so that means it took them from 1840 to 1863 somehow to make 90 locomotives and hundreds of railroad cars, which would have been impossible if construction of railroad lines to the city sparked its growth in the decades following the American Civil War. Now, I guess the question would be, did the American Indians have the ingenuity to create a locomotive? And since railroad tracks are made out of steel, how did they make the railroad tracks? So right here on Wikipedia, where I looked up the rail profile, it says early rails were made of wood, cast iron, or wrought iron. All modern rails are hot rolled steel with a cross section. Okay, so the early railroads were made of iron, and we just learned that the Virginia Indians in the early 1600s had iron right here in the area of these major Civil War battles, which if you look around at every state, the one with the most battles was in Virginia. Now, although there are many instances of evidence towards American Indians having iron, I'm going to use this article right here that is talking about skeletons that were found in mounds in the state of Oregon. It says Baker Farm near McMinnville. The archaeological specimens found are varied. The large number of skeletons in the mound, which indicate that it was once the scene of a battle. The impression is strengthened by the fact that most of the skulls have holes in them, supposedly bullet holes. Then two distinct tribes are represented in the contour of the head, some being the typical flat head and others round. Every skeleton has a quantity of beads and other trinkets, and usually some particularly figured stones or bone instruments packed on the bracelet. In some instances, these articles were covered with a piece of iron sheeting resembling the lid of a box. On a side note, some Indians practiced head flattening as a way to resemble the gods. But what we notice in here is that it says in some instances, these articles were covered with a piece of iron sheeting resembling the lid of a box. Now, that's not iron that's beat into place. If it's sheeting, that means it was melted and then poured. So therefore, that's an instance of proof that Indians had iron. So we know they had iron. That's not the question. I can show you other examples that correlates the fact that American Indians had iron. The question now would be, did they have the ingenuity to actually create locomotives and railroad tracks and railroad cars? In order to do that, we have to look at the brother right here, Elijah McCoy, our ancestor. It says Elijah J. McCoy, born in 1844, was a Canadian-born inventor and engineer of African-American descent, who was notable for his 57 U.S. patents, most having to do with the lubrication of steam engines. Born free in Canada, he came to the United States as a young child when his family returned, becoming a U.S. resident and citizen. Says Elijah McCoy was born free in Canada. At the time, his parents were fugitive slaves who had escaped from Kentucky to Canada via helpers through the Underground Railroad. His parents arrived in Colchester Township, Ontario, Canada in 1837. Via Detroit. Elijah McCoy had 11 siblings. 10 of the children were born in Canada. Goes on to say that Elijah McCoy was educated in black schools of Colchester Township due to the 1850 Common Schools Act, which segregated the upper Canadian schools in 1850. So when he was 6 years old, they segregated the schools and he went to black schools at the age of 6. Then it says at the age of 15 in 1859, Elijah McCoy was sent to Edinburgh, Scotland, for an apprenticeship and study. After some years, he was certified in Scotland as a mechanical engineer. By the time he returned, the George McCoy family had established themselves on the farm of John and Maureen Starkweather in Yessalonte. George used his skills of a tobacconist to establish a tobacco and cigar business. It says when Elijah arrived in Michigan, he could find work only as a fireman and oiler at the Michigan Central Railroad. In a home-based machine shop in Assently, Michigan, McCoy also did more highly skilled work, such as developing improvements and inventions. He invented an automatic lubricator for oiling the steam engines of locomotives and ships, patenting it in 1872 as improvement in lubricators for steam engines. It says lubricators were a boom for railroads as they enabled trains to run faster and more profitably with less need to stop for lubrication and maintenance. Pause. So early in the game, this brother was an inventor. At the age of 15, they sent him to Europe. And then after some years, he was a mechanical engineer. So presumably, he created the automatic lubricator sometime in the 1860s. It could be possible that Elijah McCoy's father, George, was an inventor as well. It says that they went to Canada in 1837 from Detroit. Now remember, the pistol had just been invented by Germans in 1835. So when it says his parents were escaping Kentucky as slaves, no, they were Indians being ran off their land, and possibly where they had their railroad tracks and locomotives already. And that's probably what influenced young Elijah McCoy to even have his mind set on inventions and coming up with a new way to make the locomotive run better, because somewhere in his family they were already doing that. Now, to add on to that, we're going to say that right here it says in 1835 the first railway in continental Europe opened. Says some sort of railroad or canal had been envisaged as early as 1830. The first trains were stepping engines imported from Great Britain. The first railroads in America was in 1826. The Mohawk and Hudson Railroad was incorporated as the first railroad chartered in New York State, and the first railroad in the United States designed to be powered by a locomotive engine as opposed to horse-drawn or gravity railroads. So Europe had just got going in 1835 with the trains. Then in 1859, they brought young Elijah McCoy from the United States over to teach him or train him as a mechanical engineer. But if you know how they operate, it's 2020, so you can think about it. They didn't take a young so-called from the United States to teach him something. And then if you notice, they said that he was a tobaccoist. Tobaccoist is an Indian, or that tells you that he's an Indian. But he came back also as a railroad oiler and eventually went on to create the automatic lubrication system for the train. In my mind, they took him over there so he could teach them something. Through the history books, which has all been a lie, so therefore, if it's a lie, then what's the truth? If it's a lie, then what's the truth?